In this week's Torah portion, we read one of the most famous lines of the Torah that is actually recorded in the prayer books, and we recite it daily. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling place is Israel. The question to consider is, what is the connection, the idea, the reference to a tent and then after a dwelling place, and the switch from Jacob to that of Israel? Well, let's consider. His name is Yehoshua Friedman. Yehoshua Friedman emigrated with his family at a young age to Israel, and it was there that the family made their life. Naturally, when he turned 18 years old, he signed up for the military. It was a tense time with Egypt, and the risks to young soldiers was certainly great. Many a parent had a sleepless night, worrying and hoping against hope that their children would return home safely one day. Friedman and his battalion were actually stationed in the Sinai Desert. And there was a lot of tension at that time. There were frequent exchanges of fire between Israel and Egypt. And then after a period of time, Israel had the upper hand and thankfully ultimately prevailed. It was time for Friedman's platoon to make their way back home. The commander turned to them all, told them to gather their stuff. They're going back to base. Friedman approached his commander and he said to him, "I'm sorry, it's just a few hours before Shabbat. And if we start to make our way back home now, I'll be traveling on the Shabbat," which of course is forbidden. The commander looked to him rather cynically, and not being one who is sympathetic to religion, and said, "Don't be absurd, we're going back to base." But Yehoshua Friedman stood his ground and was rather insistent, at which point the commander turned to him and said, "Aval zeh pikuach nefesh, it's a life-threatening situation. Doesn't that override Shabbat?" And Friedman looked to his commander and said, "Well, that's the point. We're no longer engaged in battle. It's over. We've won. Now we're going back to base. There is no longer a situation of pikuach nefesh. There's nothing life-threatening anymore, so I cannot violate the Shabbat." And with that, the commander stormed off with the rest of his troops. Yehoshua Friedman spent his Shabbat in the desert, waiting till he was able to finally see 3 stars up in the sky, and knew that Shabbat was out and it was time to return home. When he did, he was arrested, he was court-martialed, and the judge looked to him and chastised him, telling him he has no right to disregard his commander's orders. And he said to him, "In Mea Sha'arim, that's where you can keep Shabbat. Out in the desert, there is no Shabbat." Friedman looked to the judge and said, "May I address the court?" And the judge rather cynically looked to him and said, "Okay, say whatever it is you want to say." He says, "Your Honor, why is it necessary to go out onto the battlefield? I mean, we shoot in our training grounds. We have tanks on our training grounds. Why do we have to go out onto the battlefield?" And the judge looked at him and said, "Ishtagata legamra, you're completely crazy." He goes, "The training ground, that's just practice. The battlefield, that's the real thing." And Yehoshua Friedman turned to the judge and he said, "That's exactly the point. Shabbat in Mea Sha'arim, that's just practice. Shabbat out in the desert, when you're all alone, that's the real thing." And with that, the judge paused a few moments, thought, and ultimately commuted whatever intended sentence to allow Yehoshua Friedman to do some community work and enabled him to stay and remain within the military. There are 2 dimensions to our lives: what we are like in the practice runs and what we are like when confronted with the real thing. When we step out into the world and we have to impress those around us, that's our practice runs. But when you are alone, with everything switched off around you, everything but your soul, just some mere solitude, quiet time alone with nothing and no one else in the world that moment, there's no one to impress, to imitate, to appease, it's what you're like in that moment that reflects the real you. Jacob was like a tent. Indeed, he spent so much of his time in tent, studying, absorbed in his own spiritual cocoon. That was his practice run. But when he was subsequently named Yisrael because he was on the battlefield winning against prevailing enemies, that was the real thing. That was the real him. How goodly is it, Matova Ohalecha Yaakov, when we evolve from a flimsy life of practice runs, Mishkanatecha Yisrael, to finding our real selves on the battlefield of life, leading a more structured existence. You know what it said? The greatest challenge in life is discovering who you are. The second greatest challenge is being happy with what you find. Shabbat Shalom.